Hello and welcome to When Documenting is Designing, How to Assist API Design as a Technical Writer. My name is Fabrizio Ferri, and in this talk I'm gonna talk about how technical writers can assist teams in doing API design, which is something that I did in the past. So before we start, some bits about myself. Currently, I'm working as a senior staff technical writer at Splunk, as a remote technical writer. Previously, I worked as a technical writer at other places, just King, New Relic, and Open. At Open is precisely where I got acquainted with API documentation and API design. And the story I'm gonna tell you through these slides and the tips that I'm gonna share with you are based on my experience working at Open. Before we start, I would like to share this core assumption with you. And this is something I strongly believe in, and I think it's something that can also shape your career if you strongly believe in it, which is this sentence here that writers, technical writers in our case, can improve pretty much anything that is built using words. And by anything, I mean pretty much anything, from UI text to metadata, technical documentation, of course, but even code, like variable names, copy in marketing pages, and other stuff. So anything that is written can be improved by a writer. That's because words happen everywhere, especially in technical products. You see here several levels of layers of product detail, from backend to the actual workflows that users follow. And for each of those levels, there is text happening. There are words. For instance, in the backend, you may have code comments. For APIs, there is API documentation. In user interfaces, you have embedded documentation or UX writing. And of course, you have user documentation when you have to document the actual workflows, things that the users must do. Words also happen to be design. And in this particular case, I would like you to focus on two things, APIs and UIs. Both are user interfaces, and both have some sort of writing or copywriting happening, even though it's not called like that. In the case of APIs, there's API design. And in the case of user interfaces, you got UX writing. So the programmatic equivalent of UX writing, in my opinion, is API design. The words that you use to describe your API enable conversations between software and people. It's just a bit more structured and mechanical. That's why technical writers are very suited to assist technical teams in doing API design, especially when an API-first design approach is followed. So what's with APIs? What makes them special? What is different about documenting APIs and designing APIs? Where can technical writers help? So the first thing is to realize is that API designs are made of words. Here you can see an example of an OpenAPI file of the very famous Pet Store API sample. And you see there is just a text file written in YAML, and everything is words in there. I may be simplifying here, but it's true. You design APIs using words. You start from the paths, like /pets is the resource that allow you to retrieve pets in the database. Then you have documentation embedded in it. The parameters also are based on words, like limit in that case, and they carry a description. Responses, such as error responses or success responses, carry a message that is sent to users. So pretty much everywhere you look at, there is text, there are words that we can improve. APIs are made of words because they enable conversations. Maybe not the typical conversations you can imagine, but it's a conversation nonetheless between a human being or a piece of software or a machine and some other system sitting somewhere. And that is the basis really of, for instance, the REST architectural style. Here you see an example of that where the client wants to retrieve some data about a resource and sends a request. And the request is made of words, is get resource. Then that is sent over HTTP to a backend, to an API gateway. And something happens, right? Some code is run and a response is sent back to the client. So it's effectively is a conversation where there is an input and an output, and all of that is using words. But what is API design? So we know how an API works more or less, but what is designing? What does designing an API entails? API design refers to the process of developing APIs that expose data and application functionality. That's Red Hat definition. To me, API design is more about choosing the right words to enable systems to converse. This is a picture I took of a couple toy robots that I have at home. And here you can see like there is a conversation happening, and API design is about allowing these robots, these systems to talk between each other in an effective way. API design depends on how you build APIs. So there are two main approaches nowadays on how to build APIs. One is called API first, and the other is code first. In API first, you start with the design. So you use a language such as OpenAPI, a specification language, and you get feedback about the design, and then the code, the implementation must follow that design. So documentation in API first is a first-class citizen. There's another paradigm, which is code first, where you start with the code. That is usually preferred by developers, though that is changing a bit. And with code first, there is no feedback on the actual design of the API until the developers work on it, until you have something you can test. So the design is like catching up and is describing the code, and the documentation comes later. So the problem with code first APIs is that several teams may end up designing API conversations. Remember the robots in the previous slides? Those conversations may be at odds with each other and may not match customer expectations. So the problem with not designing from the start is that you may end up with lots of inconsistencies, and you don't want that. An API first workflow instead works like this. You start with a user requirement mapped as a user story. Then you do some refinement, you draft an API design, you get some initial documentation, and then you test that out. You can mock an API, you can publish the specifications and incorporate that feedback, and then you implement it. And the advantage here is that several teams can do this design work together and can coordinate before even starting to code anything, so that the end result is more consistent. The key to enable API first is API description formats or specifications. Here we have a bunch of examples. OpenAPI is the most popular, but there's also RAML, async API is gaining lots of traction. And they all share the same features, meaning that they are structured, it's structured text, it's very easy to parse, usually is JSON or YAML. And they've been created to facilitate conversation around API design and to facilitate documentation generation. They aim at being the single source of truth for API design. What happens with API design is that it's nobody's responsibility, and at the same time is a shared responsibility. As it happens, nobody really takes on the design responsibility as far as I know. Here you have a typical team structure where you have an API PMPO, maybe an engineering manager, an API architect, and then you have an API technical writer, API developers, QA engineers, but who is the designer? Who is taking care of actually designing the API? And API designers are pretty rare right now in the industry, mostly because the conversations around the design of the API should happen within the team and usually happen within the team. So if there is no appointed API designer, but there is a technical writer in the team and APIs are made of words. They are designed using words. You start seeing the connection here, right? So see the overlap here. The API designer uses words as tools. Same happens with technical writers. API designers use API description formats for designing APIs, whereas technical writers use them for documenting the APIs. API designers document as they design, while technical writers design as they document. And we're going to see how that happens. But in general, both are user advocates and both care about design and documentation, both roles. So I think that organically, what happens is that most API technical writers end up becoming part-time API designers because the team needs someone who knows the intricacies of the API description format, someone who knows how to pick the right words. And even when that doesn't happen, the push required to get there is usually very light. But why technical writers should bother? Like, okay, there is a potential overlap, and there is like an opportunity for entering API design and providing useful feedback. Why technical writers should bother at all? Well, this was my realization while working at Open, is that if I didn't provide advice on how API should have been designed, the end result would have been bad documentation. Because documenting a bad API takes way more time and generate less satisfaction in users. Since API design is like a shared concern, is a shared responsibility, but nobody officially often takes care of it, I think it's the responsibility of technical writers as user advocates to step in and own a bit API design. Here's an example. Like, okay, so I'm a technical writer. I'm going to document an error response. And here you have an example. And you get this. This is like a real example I found in the wild. It's a 200 OK response. So it's not an error, but the payload is a failure, is an error status with an error message. And that's inconsistent. Like, imagine you have to document an API like this, where a standard OK message bears an error. If someone had been there when this was designed, you wouldn't have to document this error. But how do you get into design? How do you get into API design, and how can you help? Well, I think it starts with a simple question, which is, how can I help? In my case, what I did was reaching out to the teams in charge of developing the APIs and architecting the APIs. And I offered to support them with API design inputs and procedures. So what I'm going to share now is some tips and some techniques that I put into action at Open. And they really helped me get to a point where I could assist teams with API design and documentation at the same time, while retaining API design as a shared concern. Number one is you should start advocating for API first. So what I did was pitching API first design internally, because I knew that API first design was the only way I could get design and documentation to tie in nicely and work. Finalizing engineering, product management, usually you will find very little resistance to the idea of API first. The biggest problem usually comes from developers, in the sense that they might prefer to start just coding right away from a user story, rather than waiting for a design artifact. That takes a bit of time, but I think if you show the workflows, if you show some procedures based on your stack, and then you pitch them and you ask for feedback, you're already putting API first on the map. It's important to notice here, and this is something that I discovered late, that you can still do API first and generate API specifications from the code, so that you can compare the design with the actual implementation. So it's not like if you do API first, you will not do code first design. You do API first, but you can still generate API specifications from the code as an artifact for comparison. It's also important to make sure from the very beginning that proper versioning applies to design too, so that any design artifact is versioned following, for instance, semantic versioning. Second tip here is to push for API design guidelines. API design guidelines, you can find several in the wild, in open source repositories, for instance, for big companies such as Zalando or Microsoft or others. The nice thing about guidelines is that there is this magic about guidelines that they make things more likely to happen. What I did at Open was designing guidelines that nobody asked for. Why I did it? Because eventually someone would have needed them. So I took inspiration from Zalando's and other style guides, and I adapted some principles to our own situation. And then I started building from there. So try also to make it collaborative, of course. It's not about building something in your ivory tower. Try to gather feedback and be open to changes there, because you really want everyone to own this, to feel like it's something they can use every day. Some of the sections for instance, in the API design guidelines that I made were about naming convention, error messages, also about hiding implementation details. So it's everything that, as a user advocate and technical writer documenting an API, you would care of. Then other more technical stuff also got in. Together with the API design guidelines, I strongly recommend that you create a design template. A design template, for instance, can be like a Confluence or a wiki template, or anything that you use at work, even a Word document, where you start from user stories, you identify the actors and goals in, say, a new API feature or endpoint, and then you essentially cascade down to resource naming, data models, parameters, and you end up creating the final paths. Then all that can be turned to an API specifications file, such as OpenAPI, but especially for people who is not used to OpenAPI and specification formats, I recommend that you start with something that is more digestible, such as a Confluence page. Together with the API design guidelines, because of course we are technical writers, so let's not forget about documentation. What I did at Open was creating an API style guide just for the docs. So its docs guidelines refer to the documentation bits within the API specification, such as the summaries and descriptions. And I cover things such as how should contributors write those bits? Should they put like a period at the end of the sentences in summaries? What should they call the errors, etc. Together with that, it's interesting to think about the terminology of your API or platform. And here you have an example that I developed for Open, where we try to figure out what we meant by call, what we meant by endpoint, and that shared language is something that can really help internal communication and API design. Next, of course, is, once you have done all this, make sure that you own the documentation bits in API designs. Even though design maybe is not done by you or doesn't have your feedback, you should still make sure to own those bits. So if the API specification lives on an API design platform such as Swagger Hub or Postman or any other, make sure that you have access to it, and yet you can add comments or even open pull requests, write documentation, modify documentation, because those are the bits that, as an API technical writer, most belong to you. One way to accomplish this is to embed yourself in the design process so that you can be the editor of all documentation fields. Also, make it very easy for stakeholders to request reviews. Don't go for an overly complicated workflow. Maybe you can just draw a very simple diagram or even create a task type like I did at Open in Jira with just the fields that they really need to fill out. Lower the entry barrier for stakeholders to request review to documentation. That's important. Another thing you can do is, as a writer, in general, is to provide writing expertise. And in the case of API design, one of the most important services you can offer to teams is to provide naming expertise. Naming is very, very important to API design, because resources, parameters, all that are words that require careful naming decisions. I can tell you that back at Open, we spent sometimes weeks trying to come up with the right names for resources, because if also to avoid breaking changes, you don't want a name to change in the future. So that's very important, and I think developers really appreciate when there is a writer, someone who is good with words around to decide things like that. So you can start by suggesting alternatives, or even just raising concerns about names that you see in API designs. Take into account that issues with naming, can be caused by something bigger that you may not be seeing, such as product decisions, or maybe there is a terminology issue in the industry, or maybe there is some past decisions that are, creeping in the design. So be careful. I mean, suggestions is the way to go, but try also to do your own research to understand why PMs or developers came to a certain conclusion. Another good idea that I suggest in relation to this is to set up some office hours, create your own Jira project, your own Confluence project, Trello board, whatever, just to raise visibility that you are around, that you can help with this stuff. And as API design is a shared concern, and it's a shared responsibility, there is a social aspect to it. So my next recommendation is to set up, even host API design reviews. This is what I did at Open, is together with a fellow product owner, we hosted these API design reviews where everyone came in, bringing their own design questions and their own designs that they wanted to get approval on or just get feedback on. And we were all there in a meeting room, or more recently in a Zoom call, just trying to discuss API design issues. This is helpful not just to unlock API design decisions, but also to get people on the same page when it comes to design, to how you design APIs in your company. And sometimes we even brought up things that became changes to the API design guidelines because there were exceptions to be made, or there were some corner cases that we didn't identify. Next is error messages. They're often overlooked, but I would say fight for meaningful error messages. It's really painful as a technical writer to have to document error messages that don't make any sense. And it's important that you get there as soon as possible, because sometimes error messages, changes in error messages can become breaking changes. So API consumers are going to see them every day. So you really want them to make sense and to be clear. We as technical writers are often the first people to see those errors. So as soon as you see them, make sure that you get your feedback to the right places. This is another interesting action for the more technical minded among you, which is to build an API viewer. At Open, what I did was I cobbled together, I created this React project, and I cobbled together some modules like Redoc, Axios for doing HTTP calls, and then I connected directly to our Postman instance, and the end result was a rather primitive but functional viewer that everyone could access to see the API designs and comment them and just share them maybe in meetings. So having a simple solution like that, maybe with the help of a front-end developer or an in-house developer, can be like a prelude to even a client-facing developer portal. You start by showing how API designs and API specifications can become API documentation. So it's something that is not required, but I think it enables conversations and it facilitates conversations a lot. These were the ingredients that I used for my API viewer at Open. First of all, I had all the API specifications hosted in Postman. Then I created this React starter project, which is very simple, it takes only a couple minutes. And I edited the app.js file to add these functions to call the Postman API using Axios, which is a very famous, very well-known library for HTTP calls. Then I created these very simple UIs using Bootstrap to just select the APIs and the versions of the API specifications, and added some code to glue all the pieces together. Then the specifications, when they were retrieved, they were rendered by Redoc. Could have been Swagger too. Both allow you to render API specifications using React components. I would like to end this presentation with a few resources. The first being The Design of Web APIs by Arnaud Lorette. It is a fantastic book. It has a chapter on technical writing, by the way, and it really illustrates the thinking behind API design and how you should do it. Next is APIs U18, which is a website but also a Slack community, similar to the Write the Docs community. And very often you will see there are people coming in and sharing their concerns or even samples of bad API design. And it's priceless as a learning resource and also as a community to feel more involved with API design. Well, thank you very much for attending this talk, and I hope it gave you some interesting ideas. And now it's time for some questions.
Thank you for an awesome presentation. We've got a pretty healthy number of questions, so
yeah,
I figure we'll just jump in. I thought we might lead with a question that Lexi had asked a while back. We had a few questions about adjusting to this API first mindset. Lexi had asked, how might you apply some of these learnings to a writer coming to an API with perhaps a lot of API design that already exists?
Yeah, so it's difficult, of course. You like at Open, it took just months, just for setting the stage for API first, and they didn't even start the API design back then. So even if the company you work for is doing code first, that's not the end of the work. Like, you can still own pieces of the design, and you can start from the documentation. You also have to find a way of getting the documentation bits in place through the code. So I would strongly recommend that, imagine that the API is built using .NET, for instance. In that case, see if you can modify the swashbuckle decorators for the Open API docs in the code. So it's about getting the trust from the developers in order to do those changes in the code, which is just documentation. That in itself, raises the trust of the developers in your work. And then there's other pieces all around that you can fight to improve. One is error messages, for instance. Anything that is a string literal, you should have the power to replace, as developers do, within the same code base. I would also suggest to stay tuned for following iterations of the API. Like, for instance, if V2 is coming and there will be a major redesign, that might be a good time for suggesting a shift of paradigm, so that you go API first. And also another way is to, even if code first is the way for the company, that doesn't prevent you from creating the API documentation and using the code generated Open API specs as an artifact to compare the docs with the code. And design discussions can happen anyway, even if it's code first. The only thing is, the major difference is that you will not be writing the specs first. You will be following, but if you are involved in the discussion, the change will happen in the code. So let's just say it's not impossible to collaborate as a technical writer. It just requires you to be more like a developer, in the sense that you apply changes directly to the code. So it's less direct.
Cool. Yeah, it's a lot of talk of building trust mutually with developers. I found a question that I would associate with maybe some imposter syndrome. This person has wondered about the possibility that they're working on API design with people who might have a lot more experience, whether it's domain or technical experience and knowledge. So do you have any suggestions for how to overcome that?
Well, So at Open, I was working directly with the lead architect. There wasn't much of an issue for a simple reason, and the reason is that API design itself, there is no owner. Like I haven't met yet anyone with that role in a company, like API designer. I've seen maybe a couple job ads for API designers around, but the position doesn't exist like it happens for UX writers or content designers. And I think we will see those positions opening up in the future, for sure. But for now, API design, like the words you're using to describe API and how the interaction should happen, really is a shared concern. Like nobody is really owning it. Sometimes it might be an architect, sometimes it might be a product owner, but I think you should not feel bad. Like I had imposter syndrome, of course, we all have it. But you should frame this as a collaboration. Like, how can I help you? Like, I'm not looking for owning this, though eventually it might happen. And eventually you might end up enjoying it. But everything should start as helping out, as collaboration. And I can tell you, since this is not an established role in any team, everyone is going to appreciate that help.
Thank you. Yeah, I can attest to that feeling as well. I'm picking up some amount of work at my own workplace that doesn't quite belong to anybody. And there's the danger of being found out as an imposter, so-called imposter, and also the sense that we're in uncharted territory. So,
the other thing I would recommend that was in one of the slides is to set up collective processes like design review meetings, so that anything that happens is discussed collectively. And at least for some decisions, that makes lots of sense and can help you troubleshoot and identify things you don't want to slip into your API design. But I found these meetings to be enormously useful to reach consensus. Because in the end, what you want is consensus among several developer teams, even if it's just terminology, because resource of a particular microservice API, you may end up calling them from a different microservice API. So it's important to have a space like a meeting or a channel where you can get people onto the same page, and you can be coordinating that process. Even just coordinating that is so useful in itself.
Agreed. I'm going to pose a question to you that Coley had typed into our chat. Coley had asked, did your colleagues use your office hours? How did you make them really effective? And she's asking because she just implemented this concept a few years ago and she wants to maximize it.
Yeah. So in the end, they used they reached out to me directly, like they didn't use the office hours. So that didn't work out well, but I would say it's mainly because of my lack of discipline in that sense, because I can't say no. So people came to my desk when there were still no COVID around, and later on they opened a chat message, and I was like, yeah, tell me about it. But yeah, that can generate lots of interruptions and lots of work out of nothing. So it really depends on how you want to structure your day. Like if you are open to messages or people pinging you on Slack, and you don't feel the urge of getting back immediately, you can work like that, async fashion. Otherwise, you can have office hours, and office hours, it's no waste of time, because if nobody comes, you can still work on whatever you were working on. So it's nice to have all those points of contact, so that people can reach out to you in different ways. There's people who feels more like prefer the immediacy of opening a chat message, and people who prefers to schedule something in your agenda. So it's a nice option.
I've also set up office hours myself that become effective this week, but so far it's crickets. Nobody's signed up for any slots. I see that Coley has also followed up in our chat saying that she has also accepted some of those direct requests and then gone ahead and scheduled those requests during the office hours that she already set up. But
yeah. But apparently office hours are an issue also for engineering and pretty much every role. Like they look like a good idea, but people end up being more spontaneous, especially when the company is remote or working remotely.
It's a fine balance to tread.
Yeah.
One more question. Looks like we've got a question from Elena. Fabrizio, you had told about API docs or working from them from scratch only for, I think, one example language. If you need to provide an auto-generated API for 2 or more languages, how might you solve that problem?
Oh, you mean like code examples for calling the API?
That would be my guess. You can see what Elena says in our chat.
I think there was also a question from Sam, I believe, on automation. So I feel it's kind of connected. Yeah, so there are bits, those are the bits probably automate. Like there's excellent libraries out there to generate simple code samples that you can then embed as in your code, in your specification as OpenAPI requests examples. There's other things you can automate. So linting is definitely one to check the quality of the OpenAPI spec. Going forward, and this is a path that I haven't explored, but it's another benefit of API First is that you can automate API testing from the specification. So there's libraries out there that allow you to generate test suites from the specs to generate test calls and then see if the API is behaving against the contract. So it's contract testing really. But those automation bits don't detract from the documentation and the design that happens before. So I think it's more like a benefit or a safety net for the writer, because it means that you haven't introduced anything wrong during build. So I'm totally in favor of automation, and technical writing and design tasks cannot be automated. So don't fear the robots.
Thank you for saying that. We've got a couple more questions, but I think we will just have time for one more from Susanna before we go into the break. And Susanna had asked, how do you effectively review error messages when they are spread all over the repo and there is no log of recent changes? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So I would suggest that developers will immediately see the value of meaningful error messages. But for you to be able to create meaningful error messages and maintain them, you need a mechanism in place, much like localization of strings, that allow you to have everything in one place. So at Open, we also have this issue. And essentially what I recommend is that you figure out together with the architect or the developers a mechanism by which you can separate those error messages from the code in a way that they only have to reference maybe like a code ID, but you can't take ownership of the error message. Otherwise, it gets like very complicated to track all the error messages. Of course, you can grep, you can search for text strings in the repo in order to do replacements. One word of caution here is that in some cases, customers use literal error message strings in order to debug their own systems or react to exceptions. So be very careful, like check with the customers, check with implementations teams, how those error messages are being used before you change anything, because it may end up breaking some implementations. So you really want to be cautious there. But I think the primary thing is to make sure that developers understand that you care about the quality of the error messages and that you are able to help with this.
Good luck, everybody. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. And we'll see you around.
Yeah, cheers. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out and write the docs.
Awesome. Thank you, Fabrizio.
Cheers. Bye-bye.